In this video, we will have a look at the three different loop structures that we can use in Java. Now, what is a loop? A loop is a sequence of instructions that is continually repeated until a certain condition is reached or met. Now, we get three loops in Java. We get the while loop, we get the do while loop, and we get the for loop that we can use. So let us do a slight example here. So the first thing that you need to know is that for every loop that you use, you need a loop control variable. So I'm going to call this X will be my loop control variable. The next part, you need to actually use your loop. So the second part will be to type the keyword while. If you were busy with the while loop, in this case we are busy now with the while loop, we'll look at the do while and the for loop as well. So we start off with the loop control variable. So that's the very first step. You need to declare the loop control variable and initialize it, give it a value. In this case, we're setting it to 0. Then in the while loop, we need to have some condition that we can test for. So in this case, we're going to test for while x is less than 5. We will keep on doing something in the loop. And now you can see for the while loop, there's no semicolon at the end. So whatever we want to loop then now must be in these two brackets. So we're going to have a simple system out print line there that just says hello world. So up until this stage, we've got the loop control variable declared and initialized, in this case to 0. Then we test the loop control variable using a specific value. And then the last step will be we need to change the loop control variable. So in this case, I want to say something like x equals x plus 1, which means I'm going to replace whatever x's value are at this stage, which is 0, and I'm going to add 1 to it. So it's basically the 0 there plus the 1, which will replace it with a 1. And then the loop will execute again, and we try and test. Is x still less than 5? Yes or no? So you can see by every time adding 1 to the loop control variable, we will get at a point where x is not less than 5 anymore. And then the while loop will stop executing. So let's just go through this again. There's a loop control variable. It must be declared and initialized. So that's step number 1. Loop control variable initialized. Step number 2, in your while loop, you must test using that loop control variable. In this case, we're testing. We're going to run this loop while the x value is still less than 5. At this stage, it's 0, so you can see it will go into the loop because 0 is less than 5. So it will print out hello world every time it runs. And inside of the loop, when we're done, we will make sure that we change that variable so that x becomes then 1. Is 1 still less than 5? Yes, print out hello world. Then we increment it again. Is it now 2? So is 2 less than 5? Then 3 less than 5, 4 less than 5. And when we get to 5 there, is 5 less than 5? No. And then it will exit the loop. So let's just run this quickly and see how many times it will actually run this loop. So you can see there's the loop now. It basically went for x equals 0. There's the first one. Then we incremented x equals 1. Then x equals 2, then x equals 3, and then x equals 4, because 4 will be the last value that is still less than 5. So your loop executed exactly 5 times. Okay, now another way of saying x equals x plus 1 would be just to go and say, I'm just going to do it at the bottom, x plus equals 1. So that's the same as saying x equals x plus 1. So if I say x equals x plus 2, I can make that a 2 as well. So x plus equals 2. But if you're going to keep at only incrementing, adding 1 to the variable, the shorthand code for that will just be x plus plus. So x plus plus will be adding 1 to your variable. So I'm going to keep it at x plus plus, which means that I'm going to just take x there, and I'm going to add 1 to x the whole time. Okay, so if we run it again, you'll see it's only still those 5 times it prints out hello world. Right, so now that's the while loop, and that's how the while loop works. But if I remove one of the steps there, for example, this step there where we increment it, you can see there it says it will always be true, which means that this loop will never end. So if I run it now, we get to something that we call an infinite loop. you can see there my program is still running. You can see it going berserk there at the side. It's keeping on printing out hello world, and it will never ever stop because I didn't tell it when to stop. I said, well, stop when x is less than 5, but x stays 0. We're not changing it at all. So it will have an infinite loop. So I can stop it there using the stop button on the left-hand side, but there's no other way for me to stop that. Okay, so let me just use an x++ there, which means that we're going to keep on adding 1 to that 0 until it's not less than 5 anymore, and then it will stop the loop. Okay, so that's basically how the while loop, the basics for the while loop. So let's try and do the same thing for the do while loop. So just before all of these, I'm just going to print out a system out print line, which will just add a new line between the two loops. Okay, so now let's try the exact same thing, but now we're going to use a do while loop. So I'm going to say int, let's use the y variable now, integer y equals 0. So again, we will step number 1 will be to initialize, or first declare and then initialize the loop control variable. So there's the loop control variable again. And then the next step will be to actually use your loop. So in this case, the do while loop looks like this. Now you can see that here we did not have a semicolon at the end of while, but when you're using a do while, there's your brackets. And it's the same brackets that we would use there in the while loop. Let me just get to, okay, well, let me just leave it as that. So there's the do while loop. There's your opening bracket and your closing bracket, which will be the same as your opening and closing bracket there. Okay, so we're going to have do. What do you want to do? First thing that we want to do is we want to print out hello world. I'm going to use the same example again. So we print out hello world. And then we must test for something. So in this case, when we're testing, we're going to test the same as what we did there with the while loop. I'm going to say while the x, no, not x in this case, the y, while the y is still less than 5, we will keep on doing something. But now we must also remember to do step number 3 there, which will be your loop control variable needs to be adjusted. Okay, so how does the do while loop work? First, there's a loop control variable. We initialize it to 0. Then we get into it and we print out hello world. We increment or we change the y variable, and then we test for the y. Okay, so it's a bit different than you did in the while loop. So the while loop, we call the while loop a pre-test. Let's call it pre-test loop, which means that we first test before we execute anything, which means that a while loop can execute 0 or more times. Because if we make x 5 there, it will never execute because x is not less than 5. Or 5 is not less than 5 in that case. So we test right at the beginning. So we call this a pre-test loop. Now for the while loop, we call this a post-test loop, which means that we will first do something and then test. So you can see that we start with y as 0, then we print out hello world. So how many times will the do while loop run? At least once. So it will be 1 or more times. So we're going to first print out hello world, then increment, make the 0 a 1, and then test. Is y, which will then be 1, is it less than 5? Yes, it is. So we print out hello world again, increment it again. Y becomes 2. Is 2 still less than 5? Yes, and so it carries on until the y value there is incremented up to the value of 5, where 5 is not less than 5 anymore, and the loop will stop executing. Okay, so let's run this program again. So you'll see that this while loop will now print out 5 times hello world, and this one should also now print out 5 times hello world. So there you can see there's the first loop, hello world for 5 times, and then 5 times again. So it's basically doing the same thing for both loops here. So you'll use a while loop when you do not want the statements to be executed if a condition is false right at the beginning, that we call a pre-test loop. But for the do while loop, you'll use this when you want statements to execute at least one time. Now let's look at the basics for the for loop. So the for loop has got the following form. Basically looks just like that. That's the most basic form for a for loop. And you'll see there that it's got 3 parts. And it's the same as the 3 parts that we had with a while loop. We've got a loop control variable, that's the first part. we need to test it, and then we need to increment it or decrement it, basically change it. So there's the loop control variable where you initialize it, you test it, and then you change it. And that's the exact same thing for the 3 parts for the for loop there. If I leave the for loop like it is now, I'm going to print out hello world again. This is the most basic form of a for loop, is just this form that we've got there. So if I run this now, you can see that it will still print out the first, well, I can't see it because that for loop now is in an infinite loop again. But those 2 for loops would have, the 2 loops at the top would have still printed out 5 hello worlds, and the other one also 5 hello worlds, and then we will get into this part where it's an infinite loop again. So this is the most basic form for a for loop, is like this, where you just have the 2 semicolons, but it needs the 3 parts. So the first part will be where we declare our loop control variable. So I'm going to use an I there, and I'm going to start at 0. So that's the first part. You can see it's the same as the while loop. We first declare and initialize your loop control variable. So that's the first part. The second part is testing it, like we did in the while loop, x less than 5. So let's just make it I less than 5 here, because we're working with the variable I. And then the last part of your for loop will be what we said here in the while loop also. We need to change the loop control variable. So in this case, I'm going to use I++. And then we've got exactly the same thing as we did with that while loop. So if I run this now, well, before we run it, let's just add another system out print line there. So we've got 5 hello worlds, 5 hello worlds, and another 5 hello worlds, hopefully. So let's just run it quickly. So you'll see there we've got 5 hello worlds, 5 hello worlds, and 5 hello worlds. So this is the 3 loops then that you get in Java. So again, the while loop is a pre-test loop, the do while loop is a post-test loop, and your for loop is also a pre-test loop, just like your while loop. And now you can also see that there's no semicolon at the end of the for loop. It's only in the do while where we have a semicolon at the end. So please make sure about that. So that's the 3 different loops that we've got. So just as a summary, when do we use the while loop? Use the while loop when you do not want the statements to be executed if a condition is false right at the beginning. When do you use the do loop or the do while loop? You use that when you want statements to execute at least once, because it executes first and then it tests. It's a post-test loop. So when will we use the for loop? Because the for loop and the while loop is basically the same thing. Both of them are pre-test loops. So when do we use the for loop then? You use this where there's some type of counting variable that can be evaluated. So most of the times, if you know exactly how many times you want to execute your loop, then you can use the for loop. If you don't really know how many times you're going to execute your loop, then the while or the do while loop will be a better one to use. Just one last thing that you need to note here with the for loop. Please do not add an I++ there at the end. This just means that we are incrementing 2 times. So the for loop starts with initializing the control variable, then testing it, then doing whatever is inside of the brackets, and then increment or changing the variable. So by adding another I++ there, we're basically saying increment it 2 times. So remember to not put your increment or your change inside of the brackets. Your change should be the last part of your for loop statement.